June 1948. Tempelhof Airfield, Berlin. The dawn is a cold, metallic gray. The city is silent, a tomb of rubble and hunger. The only sound is the distant, grinding hum of Soviet generators, powering the searchlights that sweep the empty corridors of air over the Soviet zone. Then a new sound. A deep, throbbing drone cutting through the overcast. It grows, persistent, undeniable. From the west, a dark shape emerges from the clouds. A C-54 Skymaster, its wings heavy, its propellers slicing the damp Berlin air. It descends in a tight, precise curve, wheels kissing the scarred tarmac of Tempelhof with a shriek of rubber and a puff of smoke. Before it even rolls to a stop, another is already on final approach. Then another. From the windows of skeletal apartment blocks, faces appear. Hollow eyes watch as the first aircraft's cargo doors clang open. Not troops. Not weapons. Sacks of flour. Medicine. The lifeblood of a city whose veins had been severed by a Soviet blockade just days before. This is not an invasion. It is a suspension of gravity. A defiance of geopolitical reality. In their headquarters at Karlshorst, Soviet officers monitor the radar scopes. The blips are relentless. One every 3 minutes. A bridge not of steel and stone, but of propellers and political will. They had expected capitulation. They are witnessing, instead, the birth of an aerial siege in reverse. For the commanders of the Red Army, the masters of the deep battle and the artillery barrage, the arithmetic of survival is being rewritten before their eyes. And the first cold trickle of disbelief begins to seep into their certainty. To understand the shock of the Soviet high command, one must first map the fractured landscape they believed they controlled. The Berlin blockade was not a sudden impulse, but the violent culmination of a 3-year chess game played on the ruins of the Third Reich. The board was set at Yalta and Potsdam. Germany and its symbolic heart, Berlin, were divided into zones of occupation. American, British, French in the west, Soviet in the east. But Berlin itself lay deep inside the Soviet zone, an island of Western influence 110 miles from the nearest Allied border. It was an administrative anomaly that Stalin viewed as an intolerable thorn. His strategic goal was clear: to squeeze the Western Allies out of Berlin, thereby delivering a catastrophic blow to their prestige in Europe and forcing a weakened, unified Germany under Soviet sway. The initial Soviet tactics were attritional. From 1945 onward, they systematically hindered Western road, rail, and barge access to the city. Checks, delays, repairs to bridges. It was a war of bureaucratic pinpricks, designed to test resolve and normalize hardship. The Western response was measured, often frustrated, but continued. The catalyst was currency. In June 1948, the Western Allies introduced the Deutsche Mark in their zones, including West Berlin, to halt hyperinflation and spur economic recovery. To Stalin, this was the final, unforgivable act of separatism. It would create a prosperous Western enclave inside his zone, a capitalist beacon that could destabilize his East German satellite. On June 24, 1948, he played his ultimate card. Citing technical difficulties, the Soviet Union announced the complete cessation of all rail, road, and water traffic between the Western zones and Berlin. The city's 2.2 million inhabitants, still living in the shadows of the bombed-out Reichstag, were cut off. The lights, the heat, the food, all were to be switched off. The Soviet calculation was clinical. General Lucius Clay, the American military governor in Germany, estimated Berlin had only 36 days of food and 45 days of coal. Stalin was confident the numbers didn't lie. No modern city could be supplied by air alone. The humanitarian crisis would be immediate and horrific. The Western powers would face a brutal choice: abandon Berlin in disgrace or start a war over a supply route. Stalin gambled they would choose disgrace. He believed he held all the cards, his hands strengthened by the sheer physical reality of geography and the crushing weight of logistical impossibility. In Washington and London, the panic was palpable. Military advisors presented stark options: retreat or send an armed convoy down the Autobahn, risking a direct clash with Red Army tanks. The Third World War seemed to hover over the German plains. But in Berlin, a third, almost unimaginable option was taking tentative shape. A slim, fragile thread across the sky. The Western response began not as a grand strategy, but as a stopgap. On the very day the blockade began, the United States Air Forces in Europe, USAF, had a single squadron of C-47 Skitrans, the military version of the DC-3, in Germany. These aircraft, workhorses of World War II, could carry about 3 tons of cargo each. On June 25, with no higher authorization, the local USAF commander ordered them to fly into Berlin. The first mission, dubbed Operation Vittles, was a symbolic gesture, a holding action. It carried 80 tons of supplies, a fraction of what the city needed to survive, let alone thrive. In Washington, the debate raged. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were deeply skeptical. The Luftwaffe had failed to supply Stalingrad by air. How could the Allies supply a city 10 times larger? But two men became pivotal advocates for the impossible. In Berlin, General Lucius Clay, a man of granite determination, cabled Washington, "I am convinced that a determined movement of convoys would be met by force only on Soviet order. If we mean to hold Europe against communism, we must not budge." He believed the airlift could work not as a charity but as a weapon of resolve. In the White House, President Harry S. Truman, facing an election and a world watching for weakness, made a characteristically blunt calculation. Retreat was politically and strategically unthinkable. An armed convoy could trigger war. The airlift, however perilous, was the only option that combined defiance with a measure of deniability. "We stay in Berlin. Period," he decided. It was a colossal gamble with no blueprint for success. The British, under Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, immediately joined the effort. "We cannot desert these people," Bevin stated, his voice echoing in the House of Commons. The Royal Air Force launched Operation Plainfare, flying from airfields in northern Germany. The French, lacking a large transport fleet, provided critical ground support and later began flying from their zone. The alliance, so recently forged in war, was now being tested in a tense aerial peace. The initial phase was chaotic. Pilots, many of them veterans of the war, flew grueling hours in unpredictable weather, navigating crowded, unmarked corridors into airports not designed for such volume. Tempelhof, in the American sector, was a pre-war facility with short runways and difficult approaches between apartment blocks. Gatto in the British sector was slightly better but still limited. There was no coordinated flight control, no standard procedures. Aircraft stacked up over Berlin, waiting to land in what pilots called the soup. Ground crews, aided by thousands of Berliners, mostly women dubbed Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, unloaded by hand, fighting exhaustion and the elements. For the Soviet High Command in Karlshorst and Moscow, watching these first disorganized efforts, their initial shock gave way to dismissive confidence. The figures confirmed their bias. In July 1948, the airlift was delivering about 1,500 tons a day. Berlin needed a minimum of 4,500 tons daily just to avoid starvation and freezing. The math was irrefutable. The Western effort was a desperate, failing pantomime. They saw the accidents, the crashes in fog, the strained aircraft, and interpreted them as signs of systemic collapse. They intensified the pressure, sending Yak fighter planes to buzz the transport aircraft, using searchlights to blind pilots at night, and launching tethered barrage balloons into the flight paths. The blockade on the ground was absolute. The harassment in the air was meant to be the final, psychological twist of the knife. They waited for the cracks to show, for the first public appeals from Berlin's leaders for relief at any cost. They waited for the West to admit the obvious, that you cannot feed a metropolis through a straw. But they had misjudged not just the technical potential of their adversary, but their will to systematize the impossible. The chaos of June and July was merely the first stumbling movement in a symphony that was about to find its conductor. The stage was set for a fundamental clash of ideologies, one that believed in the decisive power of closure and denial, and another that was beginning to pioneer the science of open-ended logistical perseverance. This sets the scene of initial Western resolve and Soviet confidence. The Berlin airlift was not won in the war rooms of Washington or London alone. It was won in the frozen mud of loading ramps, in the vibrating cockpits of aging aircraft, and in the determined, hungry streets of Berlin itself. It was a victory of systems, yes, but systems operated by human beings operating at the very edge of endurance. The most visible faces were the pilots. They were a mix of seasoned veterans and young reservists, flying aircraft that were often worn from wartime service. Their mission was a relentless, grinding routine. Fly to Rhein-Main or Wiesbaden in West Germany, load up, fly one of 3 20-mile-wide air corridors into Berlin, land, unload in a frantic 25-minute turnaround and fly back. They did this for 16-18 hours a day. The corridors were rigidly fixed by agreement. A single degree off course meant entering Soviet airspace, risking interception or worse. The weather was a perpetual enemy. Freezing fog that iced wings, sudden storms over the Harz Mountains, low visibility that turned the final approach into an act of faith. On the ground in Berlin, an army of civilians met them. The Trümmerfrauen were joined by men, teenagers, and off-duty police officers. They formed human chains, passing sacks of flour, drums of fuel, and crates of dried milk from cargo holds to waiting trucks. There was no mechanized handling equipment. It was sheer muscle and sweat. They worked in rain, snow, and the bleak winter dark, their breath steaming in the cold, their hands raw. They were paid not in valuable Western marks, but in a special airlift script, yet they came shift after shift. They were not just moving cargo, they were building their own lifeline one sack at a time. Then there were the unsung architects, the logisticians and weather officers. They calculated tonnage with obsessive precision. Coal was the heaviest need for power plants and heating. Flour was bulkier. Medicine was light but critical. They learned to pack planes like three-dimensional puzzles, balancing weight and space. They devised faster loading procedures using roller conveyors and pre-packed pallets, a revolutionary concept born of necessity. Weather teams worked around the clock, providing minute-by-minute updates for the fragile window of safe flight. A single forecast error could stack dozens of planes in holding patterns, burning precious fuel and losing precious time. And then a human touch that transcended logistics, the candy bombers. USAF Lieutenant Gail Halvorsen, moved by the sight of children watching planes from behind a perimeter fence, began dropping handkerchief parachutes with attached sweets, gum, chocolate, raisins, before landing. His unauthorized act became a sanctioned operation, Little Vittles. Soon, pilots across the fleet were doing the same. Confectionery companies donated tons of candy. For the children of Berlin, the roaring Skitrans and Skymasters became not just bringers of coal, but of hope and a shared humanity. The Rasenbomber, Raisin Bomber, entered Berlin legend, transforming the impersonal mechanics of the airlift into a gesture of profound personal connection. The statistics became a daily mantra, a measure of survival. Calories per citizen per day. Tons of coal per power plant per week. The margin for error was terrifyingly thin. Sickness rates, birth weights, and the temperature of apartment blocks became key intelligence indicators. The airlift was a vast, living organism, its health monitored not just in flight logs, but in the fading pallor of a population choosing day by day to endure. The Soviet command, watching from a distance, saw only the mechanical output. They failed to calibrate for the human input, the collective will of those who flew, loaded, and waited, turning a logistical experiment into an unbreakable covenant. By August 1948, the initial heroic chaos was reaching its limits. The accident rate was climbing. Fatigue was eroding efficiency. The airlift was surviving, but it was not yet winning. The Western Allies needed to transition from an emergency response to a precision industrial operation. The man tasked with conducting this symphony was a quiet, meticulous American, Major General William H. Tunner, who had masterminded the Hump airlift over the Himalayas during the war. Tunner arrived in Germany and saw not a miracle but a mess. His philosophy was simple and ruthless. Look, we can't have any more of this flying by the seat of your pants. We're going to run this like a conveyor belt. He imposed a radical, unemotional systemization of the impossible. The first note in his symphony was standardization. He mandated a single type of aircraft for the bulk of the lift, the C-54 Skymaster. It could carry 10 tons, triple the load of a C-47. He scrapped the patchwork of veteran pilots' individual approaches. Now every flight followed the same, unvarying procedure. Pilots were given explicit speeds, altitudes, and rates of descent. There was no room for heroics, only for clockwork. Then came the tempo. Tunner implemented the block system. Aircraft flew in a continuous, predictable stream. They took off from Western bases at precise intervals, regardless of weather over Berlin, trusting that the system would clear them. The most famous, and psychologically devastating to Soviet observers, demonstration of this was the approach and landing. Under Tunner's rules, a plane began its final descent from 5,000 feet out, following a ground-controlled approach, GCA, radar beam. It landed, rolled out, and was met by a mobile unloading crew at its exact parking spot. The engines were never shut down. Crews unloaded using specialized equipment. The pilot received a manifest for the return leg. If a plane missed its approach, it did not circle. It flew back to its base in the west. This eliminated stacking, confusion, and delay. The interval between landings at Tempelhof dropped to an astonishing 3 minutes. Day and night, in fair weather and foul, the thrum of engines over Berlin became a constant, metronomic heartbeat. The infrastructure was forced to evolve at a breakneck pace. Tempelhof's runways were reinforced with thousands of feet of pierced steel planking, creating a floating foundation over Berlin's sandy soil. But it wasn't enough. The French, using German civilian labor, performed an engineering marvel. In just 90 days they constructed an entirely new full-length airfield in their sector. Tegel Airport was built from the rubble of Berlin itself, its runway long enough for the heaviest aircraft. It became a third critical node in the supply network. On the ground in West Germany, warehouses and loading docks were expanded into vast, humming logistics parks. Coal was pre-sacked, flour pre-palletized. Technology was pushed to its limits. The GCA radar, a wartime innovation, became the linchpin of all-weather operations. Its operators, guiding half-blind pilots down through thick cloud, held the lives of crews and the fate of the city in their hands. Improved radio beacons were installed. Maintenance was overhauled into a continuous rolling process to keep the fleet airborne. Tunner statisticians tracked every metric: turnaround time, tons per aircraft per day, mechanical failures. This data-driven approach allowed for constant, micro-adjustments to the machine. For the Soviet air defense officers tracking this stream on their radars, the change was perceptible and deeply unsettling. The random, pulsating trickle of July had become, by autumn, a solid, unbroken band of luminous blips moving with mechanical regularity along the corridors. It was no longer a struggling air bridge, it was an aerial conveyor belt. They were witnessing the birth of a new form of power projection, not the explosive power of a bomber fleet, but the relentless, inexorable power of sustained logistical throughput. Their blockade was a wall. The airlift was becoming a river, and a river, given enough time, can wear down any stone. The psychological impact of this transformation was profound. The question in Karlshorst shifted from "when will they fail?" to a more disquieting, "can this ever fail?" Beyond the roar of engines and the grit of ground crews, the Berlin Airlift was a high-stakes drama of political will, a global poker game where the chips were the lives of millions and the stability of post-war Europe. The leaders involved were not just administrators of a logistics operation. They were gamblers, each betting on the other's threshold of pain and their own capacity for resolve. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin's calculus was rooted in traditional power politics and a profound misreading of his adversaries. He saw the Western presence in Berlin as a latent threat and an insult. The blockade was a low-risk, high-reward coercive tool. He believed the capitalist powers were economically weary, politically divided, and ultimately unwilling to risk a new war for a symbol. His intelligence reports, likely filtered through a lens of ideological certainty, assured him the airlift was a temporary propaganda stunt. He anticipated either a humiliating Western withdrawal or a political crisis in Berlin that would bring a compliant, unified city under his control. For Stalin it was a siege in the classic sense. Apply pressure, wait for collapse. He failed to factor in the possibility that the West could invent a new form of siege breaking, one that rendered his geographical stranglehold obsolete. His gamble was that Western will would crumble before Soviet patience. In Washington, President Harry S. Truman faced a defining moment of his presidency. The election of 1948 loomed. The Pentagon was deeply skeptical. The American public was war-weary. Yet, retreat from Berlin was anathema to the new doctrine of containment that was crystallizing in the minds of strategists like George F. Kennan. Truman's decision to commit fully to the airlift was a monumental risk. He was betting America's prestige and potentially its peace on an unproven logistical concept. He authorized a massive mobilization of global U.S. air transport resources, pulling C-54s from as far away as Hawaii and Alaska. Politically, he framed it not as an act of aggression, but as a peaceful, humanitarian response to Soviet bullying, a masterstroke of propaganda that put the Kremlin perpetually on the moral defensive. Truman gambled that American ingenuity and industrial capacity could outlast Soviet obstinacy, and that the American people would support a fight where the weapons were sacks of coal. In London, Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin provided the airlift's indispensable moral and operational backbone. Britain, still rationing food and economically crippled by the war, committed its entire civilian and military transport fleet with unwavering resolve. Bevin, in particular, saw Berlin as the literal front line. "We are not going to be bullied," he declared. The British contribution was proportionally even greater than the American, a stunning commitment from a nation on the brink of bankruptcy. Their gamble was on solidarity and the survival of a democratic European ideal. They knew that if Berlin fell, the psychological domino effect across a fragile Western Europe could be catastrophic. Within Berlin itself, leadership took a human form. The city's elected mayor, the Social Democrat Ernst Reuter, became the voice of defiance. In September 1948, standing before a crowd of 300,000 Berliners at the ruins of the Reichstag, his voice amplified by loudspeakers, he made a direct, historic appeal: "People of the world, look upon this city." He was not begging for mercy but demanding solidarity. He and his city council, operating from the shadow of Soviet threats, consistently rejected any separate deal with the occupiers of the eastern sector. The Berliners themselves, through their quiet endurance and their labor on the airfields, placed their own bet that the West would not abandon them. Their collective no to Soviet coercion was the political foundation upon which the entire aerial enterprise was built. This foresighted gambit created a dynamic where any sign of weakness would have been fatal. Stalin waited for Allied resolve to crack. The Allies waited for Stalin to recognize the futility of his blockade. The Berliners waited for proof that their sacrifice was not in vain. In this tense equilibrium, the relentless, metronomic rhythm of the airlift became more than a supply line. It was the audible ticking of a clock counting down the lifespan of Stalin's strategy. Each successful flight was a political statement. Each landed ton a vote of confidence in the Western Alliance. The Politburo in Moscow began to understand that they were not just fighting planes, but an entire political conception that was proving unexpectedly resilient. From the Soviet command post at Karlshorst in East Berlin, and from the wider corridors of power in Moscow, the Berlin Airlift presented a slowly dawning cognitive dissonance. It was a spectacle that defied the foundational principles of Soviet military and political thought. Their growing disbelief was not merely about logistics. It was a crisis of ideology. Initially, the Soviet military assessment was one of cool, professional contempt. The Glavnoy Razvedivatelnoy Upravlenie (GRU), military intelligence, provided reports on the Western Air Force's transport capabilities. The numbers were clear. The USAF and RAF lacked the theoretical lift capacity. Soviet Air Force Voyenovozdushny Sili VVS generals, masters of tactical air support and frontal aviation, knew the punishing calculus of air logistics from their own wartime experience. The failure at Stalingrad, where the Luftwaffe could not sustain the encircled Sixth Army, was a recent textbook example. The laws of physics and logistics were immutable. The West's attempt was, therefore, a political bluff, a desperate holding action before the inevitable diplomatic climb down. As the airlift organized under Tunner, the Soviet view began to curdle from contempt into active irritation. The harassment tactics, fighter buzzings, aerial accidents, blinding searchlights, radio jamming, and weather balloons, were expressions of this frustration. They were meant to fray nerves, increase the accident rate, and demonstrate Soviet control of the very airspace the corridors transgressed. But these actions had a paradoxical effect. Instead of breaking the airlift, they hardened Allied resolve and provided propaganda fodder, painting the Soviets as bullies threatening humanitarian missions. Each Soviet provocation was met not with retreat, but with tightened procedures and increased vigilance. The psychological pivot came with the realization of the airlift's systemic rather than heroic nature. Soviet monitors, watching the 3-minute interval landings continue through a Berlin winter, began to grasp that they were not witnessing a feat of bravery alone, but a feat of management. This was alien to the Soviet system, which excelled at monumental one-off efforts through sheer mass and force of will, the Stakhanovite ideal. The airlift was different. It was a decentralized, data-driven, process-optimized machine. Its strength was not in Herculean effort, but in relentless, repeatable efficiency. This was a Western capitalist industrial strength applied to military political ends, and its effectiveness was deeply unsettling. Internally, the blockade began to backfire strategically. Instead of splitting the Western Allies, it solidified them. The creation of a unified airlift command, the sharing of bases and resources, and the visible Anglo-American partnership were steps toward the formal military alliance Stalin feared most, NATO, which would be founded in April 1949. Furthermore, the blockade strangled not just West Berlin, but East German economic recovery. The Soviets had dismantled East German industry for reparations. Now, the showcase city of East Berlin was overshadowed by a Western sector being sustained by a mesmerizing display of technological prowess and solidarity. The anti-fascist democratic model was being upstaged in real time. By early 1949, the disbelief in Soviet circles turned into a quiet, strategic despair. The Easter Parade of April 1949, when General Tunner, in a deliberate show of force, landed an aircraft every 62 seconds for 24 hours, bringing in nearly 13,000 tons, was the final, undeniable proof. The airlift was not meeting the bare minimum, it was exceeding Berlin's pre-blockade supply levels. The siege was not merely being held, it was being broken wide open. For the Soviet leadership, the conclusion was inescapable and humiliating. Their primary weapon, control of territory, had been nullified by a technological and organizational countermeasure they had not believed possible. They had committed their prestige to a strategy that was now visibly, publicly failing. To continue the blockade was to subject themselves to an endless, demonstrative defeat, while accelerating the consolidation of their enemies. The airlift had rewritten the rules of engagement. It demonstrated that in this new Cold War, political will, when coupled with industrial and managerial capacity, could create facts on the ground, or in the air, that traditional military force could not reverse. The stage was now set for the climax. The turning point would not be a battle, but a recognition. The relentless stream of aircraft had become an argument too powerful to ignore. April 16, 1949. A soft spring dusk settles over Berlin. In the control towers at Tempelhof, Ghetto, and the newly built Tegel, the mood is one of focused tension, not of routine. For weeks, a plan has been in preparation, a plan not born of necessity but of statement. General William Tunner, the architect of the machine, has chosen this Easter weekend to deliver a message, not just to the people of Berlin but to the world and most pointedly, to the silent observers in Karlshorst and the Kremlin. The message is one of overwhelming, indisputable capacity. The operation is codenamed Easter Parade. Its objective is audacious in its simplicity. For 24 hours the airlift will not just function. It will peak, demonstrating a throughput so dense, so rhythmic, that it will silence all remaining doubts. The target is to land one aircraft in Berlin every minute. Not a theoretical maximum but a sustained, clockwork reality. As darkness falls, the first aircraft in the meticulously planned sequence rolls onto the runway at Rhein-Main Air Base. The weather is perfect. A clear, cold night with infinite visibility. The clock starts. The first C-54 lifts off, its navigation lights piercing the dark. 60 seconds later, another follows. Then another. They climb into the western corridors, a stately, luminous procession against the starry sky. In the cabins, pilots follow their rigid flight plans, their actions reduced to drilled procedure. There is no room for error, no margin for delay. On the ground in Berlin, the city holds its breath. The usual, comforting rumble of engines swells into a continuous, rolling thunder. From the ground, it seems as if a single endless aircraft is passing overhead, its sound unbroken. At Tempelhof, the mobile unloading crews are a ballet of coordinated motion. A C-54 touches down, its tires shrieking. It turns off the runway and is met at its hard stand by a truck and a 12-man team. The cargo doors are open before the props stop turning. Coal sacks fly down rollers onto waiting trucks. The cockpit window opens. The pilot receives a thermos of coffee and the return manifest. In 25 minutes, the aircraft is empty, refueled, and turning back onto the taxiway. As it departs for the west, another is already on final approach, its landing lights carving twin cones in the twilight. The statistics scroll in on teletypes in Tunner's command center. 12 o'clock, aircraft 41 landed. 12:01, aircraft 42 landed. 12:02, aircraft 43 landed. It is a digital heartbeat, a pulse of sheer tonnage. The system is operating beyond its designed limits, not on adrenaline but on precision. For the Berliners, the sound is a symphony of certainty. They gather on rooftops and in shattered squares, not in anxiety but in awe. The stream of aircraft is no longer just a lifeline, it is a victory parade in the sky. In Karlshorst, the Soviet reaction moves through stages. First, professional curiosity as the unusual surge in traffic is noted on radar plots. Then, incredulity as the plotters' pencils struggle to keep up with the unbroken stream of blips moving along the corridors. The airspace is saturated. Finally, a grim, silent comprehension settles over the command staff. The harassment tactics, the yaks, the balloons, the jamming, are useless against this. To interfere now would be to cause a catastrophic mid-air collision in full view of the world, an act of mass murder that would shatter any remaining pretense of a technical blockade. They are powerless. They can only watch. For 24 hours, the conveyor belt does not stop. When dawn breaks on Easter Sunday, the stream continues unabated. Children point to the sky, not at individual planes, but at the permanent, glittering chain of them. By the time the clock runs out on the operation, the numbers are staggering. 1,398 flights. 12,941 tons of supplies. Coal, flour, dried eggs, machinery, a day's delivery that exceeded the entire first month's total of the airlift. The average interval between landings was not 1 minute, but an impossible 62 seconds. The Easter parade contained no violence, no grand speeches, no territory seized. Yet it was one of the most decisive demonstrations of power in the early Cold War. It proved, with mathematical finality, that the airlift was not a precarious stunt, but a permanent, sustainable fact. Berlin would not just be prevented from falling, it could be made to prosper under siege. The blockade had not merely been neutralized, it had been rendered strategically irrelevant. The psychological cornerstone of Stalin's policy, the belief that the West would find the cost too high, crumbled in that 24-hour period. The failure was now visible, quantifiable, and complete. The thunder of the Easter parade did not immediately cease. It simply melted back into the now routine, relentless rhythm of the air bridge. But in its wake, a profound silence descended upon the diplomatic front. The demonstration had been so total, so incontrovertible, that it shifted the terrain of negotiation. The question was no longer if the blockade would end, but how the Soviet Union could end it without appearing to surrender. Throughout the spring of 1949, secret back-channel communications, often through neutral diplomats at the United Nations in New York, had been probing for an exit. The Soviet position had grown increasingly untenable. The airlift was a daily propaganda defeat. The Western counter-blockade on the flow of goods from their zones into East Germany was biting hard, stifling the Soviet zone's already crippled recovery. And the ultimate strategic nightmare was coming to fruition. On April 4, 1949 in Washington, D.C., the North Atlantic Treaty was signed, creating NATO. The blockade had directly catalyzed the very transatlantic military alliance Stalin had sought to prevent. The face-saving formula was found in a return to ambiguity. After protracted, tortuous negotiations, the representatives of the four powers announced an agreement on May 4, 1949. The communiqué was a masterpiece of diplomatic obfuscation. It stated that all restrictions imposed since March 1, 1948, the start of the Soviet harassment, on communications, transportation, and trade between Berlin and the Western zones would be lifted on May 12. There was no admission of a blockade. No mention of defeat. Just a mutual lifting of restrictions. The reaction in Berlin when the news broke was not jubilant frenzy, but a deep, cathartic exhaustion and a wary triumph. People wept in the streets, but quietly. They had endured 328 days of uncertainty, of cold, of hunger narrowly averted. They knew the aircraft had saved them. At 0:01 hours on May 12, 1949, the first British truck convoy, its headlights piercing the dark, rolled across the Helmstedt checkpoint on the Autobahn. Soviet guards waved it through without inspection. The land blockade was over. But General Tunner issued a critical, telling order: the airlift would continue. This was the final, subtle twist of the knife. Supplies would now flood in by both land and air, stockpiling a massive reserve in Berlin. The city would not just be relieved, it would be fortified against any future coercion. The Allies would end the airlift on their own terms, when they were satisfied with the stockpile levels, not when the Soviets permitted it. The conveyor belt in the sky kept running, a now voluntary symbol of overwhelming capacity. The official end came months later, on September 30, 1949. The last aircraft, a US C-54 named the Last Vittel, lifted off from Tempelhof, circled the city and flew west. The final numbers were etched into history: 278,228 flights. 2.3 million tons of supplies. Over 100,000 sorties had been flown by the USAF, over 100,000 by the RAF. Coal constituted nearly two-thirds of the tonnage, enough to build a pyramid 10 feet high and 10 feet wide stretching for 15 miles. There had been accidents, tragedies. 101 fatalities including 40 Britons and 31 Americans, most in crashes. A memorial at Tempelhof would later bear their names. For the Soviet political and military command, the unspoken lessons were corrosive and deep. They had wielded their greatest leverage, geographic domination, and it had been circumvented by a technological and organizational system they did not fully comprehend. They had seen a collective political will in the West that their ideology told them was impossible. They had provoked not division but unity, not retreat, but a dramatic escalation of their adversaries' commitment. The air bridge, Luftbrücke, entered the lexicon as a permanent symbol of Western resilience. The blockade's end did not bring peace but a new hardened status quo. In October 1949, just weeks after the last airlift flight, the Soviet zone was formally constituted as the German Democratic Republic (GDR). The Federal Republic of Germany (FRG) had been established in the West the previous May. Germany was now irrevocably split. Berlin remained a divided island, but its western half stood as a monument to a failed siege. The Iron Curtain was no longer just a phrase, it was a border, and its first great test had resulted in a stunning, non-violent defeat for the East. It was not marked by a treaty signing, but by the fading sound of Pratt and Whitney engines over Berlin, a sound that had first been a desperate hope, then a constant assurance, and finally, the audible proof of a strategic revolution. The silence that followed the last airlift flight was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a front line solidifying. The Berlin blockade and the airlift had been a violent, 15-month clarifying event. It burned away the lingering ambiguities of the post-war world and left behind a landscape of hardened, institutionalized conflict. The immediate consequences were tectonic, reshaping the map, the military alliances, and the very psychology of the Cold War. First and foremost, Germany was formally severed. The airlift had made the continuation of four-power rule in Berlin a fiction, but it had also destroyed any hope for a unified German state. In May 1949, the Western zones became the Federal Republic of Germany (FRG), with its provisional capital in Bonn. In October 1949, the Soviet zone was transformed into the German Democratic Republic (GDR). Berlin, though lying deep within the GDR, remained under four-power status, its western sectors an existential affront to the East German state. The division was no longer administrative, it was now national, political, and ideological. The airlift had proven that West Berlin could survive, thus making the FRG's claim to represent all Germans, including those in the isolated city, a plausible if precarious reality. Second, and directly causal, was the birth of NATO. The treaty was signed in Washington on April 4, 1949, even as the Easter parade was being planned. The timing was no coincidence. The blockade had demonstrated Europe's terrifying vulnerability to Soviet coercive pressure. It proved that the United States' security was indivisible from Europe's, and that mere economic frameworks like the Marshall Plan were insufficient without a binding military guarantee. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with its Article 5 Mutual Defense Clause, was the direct institutional answer to the crisis over Berlin. The Soviet action had achieved the precise opposite of its intent. It permanently anchored the American military to the European continent and unified the Western European powers under a single American-led command structure. Third, the strategic value of air power was forever altered. The airlift was a revelation. It showed that in a nuclear age where direct superpower conflict was unthinkable, air transport could be a primary instrument of national policy, a weapon of political will and logistical sustenance. The U.S. Air Force, which had just become an independent service in 1947, gained immense prestige and a compelling argument for its strategic value beyond strategic bombing. The lessons in large-scale logistics, all-weather flying, and air traffic control were seminal, directly influencing military and civilian aviation for decades. The concept of a rapid global airlift capability became a cornerstone of American power projection. Within the Soviet sphere, the aftermath was one of profound, if unacknowledged, strategic defeat. The blockade had been a colossal miscalculation. It had cemented the division of Germany on terms favorable to the West, legitimized the American presence in Europe, and provided a devastating propaganda victory for the West. The anti-fascist democratic model of the GDR was born under the shadow of the Luftbrücke, forever branded as the zone that had tried to starve its fellow Germans. Soviet military doctrine, however, internalized a different lesson. They saw the failure not as a flaw in coercive strategy, but in its execution. The blockade had not been total enough. In future confrontations, this thinking would lead to more absolute solutions, a lesson that would manifest catastrophically in 1961 with the construction of something that could not be flown over, the Berlin Wall. For Berlin itself, the city emerged transformed. West Berlin was no longer just an occupied sector. It was the front city of freedom, a symbol of democratic endurance. Its population, having passed through the hunger winter, developed a fierce, almost defiant loyalty to the Western Allies, particularly the Americans and British. The airlift created a unique bond, a moral authority that would endure for the entire Cold War. The city became a subsidized showcase, a glittering, isolated capitalist island that was both a beacon and a permanent provocation, its survival a daily rebuttal to the East. The first great battle of the Cold War had ended not with a bang, but with the drone of engines fading into the distance. But the political structures it erected, two Germanys, Two alliances, a divided Berlin, were the concrete and barbed wire upon which the next 40 years of conflict would be built. The paradigm had shifted from post-war negotiation to managed, perpetual confrontation. The Berlin Airlift did not recede into history as a mere event. It became a permanent psychological fixture in the minds of strategic planners on both sides of the Iron Curtain. For the West, it was a foundational myth of the Cold War, a story of ingenuity and resolve triumphing over brute force. For the Soviet High Command, it was a lingering trauma, a lesson in the vulnerabilities of their own worldview that would subtly, and at times catastrophically, shape their decisions for decades to come. The core Soviet lesson was a deep-seated suspicion of asymmetric responses. They had applied direct, terrestrial pressure. The West had responded not in kind, but with an indirect, technological logistical solution that transformed the battlefield from the ground to the air. This created a persistent anxiety in Soviet military thought, the fear that their massive conventional superiority in Europe could be neutralized by Western advantages in technology, organization, and air power. This anxiety would fuel their relentless drive for strategic parity in bombers and missiles, and later, their immense investments in air defense networks. The sight of those unchallengeable aerial corridors had taught them that control of the ground was meaningless if you did not control or could not negate the air above it. This lesson manifested with concrete, tragic clarity in the Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989. As the Soviet 40th Army became mired in a counterinsurgency campaign, their logistics faced a nightmare reminiscent in mirror image of Berlin. Now it was they who were dependent on extended vulnerable supply lines, the Salong Highway and a limited air bridge, snaking through hostile territory. The Mujahideen, backed by the CIA and Pakistan's ISI, waged a relentless war of attrition against these lines, using ambushes, mines and, crucially, man-portable air defense systems, manpats, like the American Stinger missile. For senior Soviet officers who remembered 1948 to 49, the echoes were chilling. They were now playing the role of the blockader, but their siege was against a diffuse, rural insurgency, not a centralized city. And their adversary was employing an asymmetric, technology-enabled strategy to interdict their logistics. The Stinger, in particular, became the spiritual successor to the C-54. It was a technological equalizer that threatened to sever their aerial lifeline, just as the airlift had severed the geopolitical logic of their Berlin blockade. The psychological impact was profound. The frustration of watching unassailable Western aircraft sustain a city had been internalized. Now they experienced the mirror frustration of watching their own aircraft, their Mi-8 helicopters and An-12 transports, become vulnerable to a weapon their enemy could carry on his shoulder. The lesson of Berlin, that will and technology could overcome geography, was being used against them. Furthermore, the airlift cemented a Western paradigm of patient endurance. The strategy in Berlin had not been to break the blockade with a sudden, decisive strike, but to out-endure it, to make the cost of maintaining the siege higher than the cost of sustaining the city. This philosophy became central to the Western containment strategy. It would be applied again in the face of Soviet provocations, from the construction of the Berlin Wall to the missile deployments of the 1980s. The message was always, you can create a crisis, but we have the technological, economic, and logistical depth to wait you out, to turn your momentary advantage into a long-term liability. For the Soviet Union, this Western capacity for endurance represented an existential problem. Their system was built for rapid, monumental mobilization, not for open-ended, resource-draining contests of stamina against more flexible, wealthier economies. The airlift was an early, glaring demonstration of this systemic weakness. Every subsequent crisis reinforced it, draining Soviet resources and morale, until the cumulative weight of these endurance contests, the arms race, the war in Afghanistan, the economic competition, contributed to the structural fatigue that led to collapse. Finally, the airlift left an indelible moral and propaganda legacy. It had framed the Cold War from its earliest days as a contest between a regime that would starve civilians for political gain and an alliance that would perform miracles to feed them. This moral narrative, crystallized in the image of the Rosin bomber, was a weapon the Soviets could never effectively counter. It gave the West a foundational claim to virtue that undergirded its ideological struggle for decades. In every subsequent confrontation from Hungary in 1956 to Prague in 1968, the memory of Berlin served as a reminder of the nature of the regime in the East. The Berlin airlift therefore never truly ended. Its reverberations echoed through the command bunkers of the Cold War, a ghost of a defeat that informed a generation of Soviet generals, and a ghost of a victory that inspired a generation of Western strategists. It had proven that in this new shadowy conflict, the most decisive victories might not be won by seizing ground, but by holding it through an act of sustained, systemic creation. The legacy of the Berlin Airlift is not etched in the stone of monuments alone. It is woven into the very fabric of modern conflict and international order. It stands as a rare, luminous point in the 20th century where ingenuity and human will converge to create a solution that was not merely an absence of war, but a positive, sustained act of peace. In the end, the airlift was a revolution in strategic thought. It redefined siegecraft, turning it from a weapon of the strong against the weak into a potential trap for the aggressor. It demonstrated that in an age of ideological confrontation, the most powerful force could be the demonstrative, patient capacity to sustain life, rather than the terrifying capacity to extinguish it. The C-54 Skymaster, in its unglamorous, repetitive labor, proved to be as potent a symbol of power as any missile on a parade stand. For the Soviet command, the shock never fully faded. Their stunned disbelief evolved into a permanent scar on their strategic consciousness. They had witnessed a form of warfare for which their doctrine had no answer, a warfare of abundance, of systemic resilience, and of political unity that transcended immediate tactical gain. This lesson, learned over the skies of Berlin in 1948, would haunt their calculations in every subsequent crisis, from Cuba to Afghanistan, a reminder that the correlation of forces included intangible elements of will and societal organization they could not easily quantify or defeat. The air bridge also forged a new template for alliance. It was not a treaty signed in a grand hall, but a covenant earned in the fog over Tempelhof and the coal dust of Gatto. It proved that an alliance could be a living, breathing mechanism, a shared burden that, in the carrying, created unbreakable bonds of trust and mutual respect. This operational trust became the bedrock of NATO, an alliance that would endure not just because of shared fear, but because of proven shared capability. And for Berlin and for the world watching, it offered a different narrative. In the shadow of the ruins of the most destructive war in history, it told a story not of revenge but of responsibility. Not of conquest but of guardianship. The Rosenbomber dropping candy was as important as the coal bomber landing on schedule. It spoke to a conscious choice to pair power with compassion, to combine strategic resolve with a human touch. Today, the endless stream of aircraft has been replaced by the silent, digital streams of data and finance that undergird the modern world. Yet, the fundamental lesson of the airlift endures, that the greatest threats are often met not with a single, crushing blow, but with the relentless, disciplined application of a better system. It was a victory of process over paralysis, of innovation over inertia, and ultimately of a stubborn, sustaining hope over a calculated, coercive despair. The final image is not of a treaty signing but of a memory, the constant, droning hum in the sky above a broken city, a sound that became, first, a question, then an answer, and finally, a permanent promise, that walls, whether of brick or of intent, are no match for the human capacity to build bridges, even when those bridges must be built upon nothing but courage and air.